The horses have a dark secret. Let me explain. Not too long ago, the overworld was finally at peace, as the Illagers had just lost their war. And as such, they had lost their population and they had lost their rule over the world. They had lost everything. But those that lived on still had something. Motivation, the drive to push on and try again. However, at that time, they were just far too weak to do anything. In fact, some of them were so weak that they couldn't even walk, and as such they were forced to spend most of their life hiding in their mansions, isolated and vulnerable. So even though most of them had that burning passion to push on, it would just be impossible for them to rise again. Or would it? As surely there must be a way that they can leave their mansions without walking. They were magical creatures after all, and so they began to think. And for years and years they were thinking, but then one day one of them had an amazing idea. The horses. The Illagers could ride horses. Not only were the horses quite easy to tame, they could also move very quickly, which meant that the Illagers could travel to their enemies before they would even get a chance to prepare, and they would be able to crush them. All of that sounded great, so the Illagers, using the very little energy that they had, crawled out of their mansions and began taming horses. It was a very slow process at first, but as more and more horses were tamed, it became easier to tame others. And after a while, the Illagers had created an entire fleet of horses, and they felt like they were now ready to attack the villagers. Except, hold your horses, they weren't quite ready. Although they could now move, they were still very weak, and as such they really wouldn't be able to attack anyone effectively, and so a decision had to be made. They would have to halt their plans on attacking for now, and instead they would have to spend their time regenerating their strength. But luckily they can now use their horses to travel the world and observe its beauty while doing so. And they hope that in the future, once they're fully healed and they've explored the world enough, they could finally attack and crush the villagers once and for all. And so over the course of the next few years, they would do just that. Travel the world and slowly regenerate strength. But as they were no longer staying in one place, they now needed a mobile source of food, as they couldn't just bring their farms along with them. But luckily, they already knew what they were going to be eating. The subscribing. The cows. But the cows that they were going to be eating were no ordinary cows, as these cows were on a magical diet. You see, the evokers were a bit impatient, and they wanted to regenerate their strength faster than what they would have done naturally. So they forced the witches to enchant flowers with their potion effects, and then they would feed those flowers to the cows. And then with the mixture of those cows, along with some mushrooms for taste, they would create magical stews. And those magical stews would give the Illagers a quick, semi-temporary boost in power. And if they ate enough of them over a long enough time, the effects would become permanent, and they would regain their strength. But to scare away anyone else from eating this stew and gaining its power, they called it the Suspicious Stew. And so it was then all was good. The Illagers were growing in power, and they were soon getting ready for an attack. But that would all change with one small mistake. A witch, whilst preparing a meal for the cows, accidentally dropped in an extract from the zombie virus which was lying around in the woodland mansion. Now, that wasn't that big of a deal for the cows. In fact, the cow wasn't affected at all by the zombie virus. However, after the cow had eaten most of the magical stew, it was fed to the horses, and they became infected. Immediately, the Illagers saw what was happening, and they tried to kill that zombified horse, not wanting another infection like they had with the zombies. But it was too late. The virus, even after the death of Patient Zero, had spread to all the other horses. And that was quite a problem, as these zombified horses were useless, as not only were they unrideable, but they also didn't listen to the Illagers, and worst of all, the virus was eating them from the inside, killing them. So after a month after the first infection, all of these great horses were dead, and the Illagers were left with useless piles of bones. Now, that wasn't great, as the Illagers had just lost their main mode of transportation, and they were still too weak to be running around. But not all hope was lost just yet, as over those last few years, the Illagers had spent their time regenerating their magical abilities, and it was at this point that they did have, once again, enough power. The power to cast one more spell. And with that one spell, they were able to combine all the bones of the dead horses into one another to create new life for unzombified horses. And very surprisingly, that spell actually worked, and the new horses were made, tamed, and the Illagers continued to use them to travel across the world and regenerate even more power. And it was then that it seemed like there could be no more problems that they couldn't overcome. so maybe soon it would be that they could regenerate enough strength to attack an enemy. But little did they know a dark secret was lurking within these new horses. You see, when the Illagers were travelling the world and regenerating their powers, occasionally it would rain, and sometimes it would even thunder. But when it would thunder, rarely, very rarely, a thunderbolt would strike one of these new horses, and then the dark secret would be revealed. But before you know what that secret is, you need to understand something. When the Illagers were casting the spell to recreate the horses, they were very weak and a little lazy, so they did mix in some bones from the other skeletons just to make more horses in a quicker time. But not only that, they also didn't complete the spell in its entirety because they just weren't strong enough yet. And so when a lightning strike hits a horse, giving it a massive surge of energy, it breaks that incomplete spell. Well, temporarily, as with that excess amount of energy, the spell stops working for a moment, and the horse is separated back into its piles of bones. But when the electric shock is over, the spell reactivates, and the skeletons come to life as the skeleton horses. But not just that, remember those other random bones added in? Well, they cause the skeletons to come to life, and they ride the skeleton horses. And so that's how the skeleton horsemen were created. But these skeleton horsemen were not peaceful creatures. In fact, they had the desire to rule the world and kill their creator. So overall, they were quite evil mobs. They also knew about the magical powers that the suspicious Jew was able to grant, and as such, they wanted the cows. But obviously, the Illagers weren't just going to let that happen. But as they were still quite weak at that time, they couldn't fight back, and so they were forced to go into hiding. But that didn't really work, as the horsemen would find them and use them to gain even more power. So now the Illagers, scared because they couldn't fight back, fled to their mansions, bringing along with them their magical cows. And then, using the very limited energy they had left, they casted a spell. A spell that removed all the cows' abilities to create these magical stews. Permanently, or so everyone thought. But the Illagers did secretly make one way for the cows to create suspicious stews again. And that ability to create suspicious stews again could only be regained through doing an act that only the Illagers believed that they could do. So what was that act? Well, it was energizing a cow that had been infected by a rare fungal virus that only cows could survive. You see, the Illagers had a case of an ancient fungal virus that had been stored away and kept as a relic for millions of years. But just as they were about to give that virus to one of their selected cows, in order to convert it to a suspicious stew creator, they dropped it, and it sunk deep into the ground. And now with the only case of that virus gone, there will be no way of creating any more of the stews. And so without the powerful stews to give the Illagers strength, they were once again forced to hide in their mansions, weak and unable to attack. And so it looked like it would be the end of the Illagers' attempts to rule the world again. But you can't rule a world that doesn't exist, as that dropped virus had started a chain reaction in the deep underground, and now a deadly fungus was starting to rise and corrupt the world. And so to learn about its devastation and the hero who ended it, watch this video.